Welcome back to the virtual companion series for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, A History, written by Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson Sr. My name is Dennis C. Dickerson Jr. The focus of this video is Chapter 6, Freedom Now, Civil Rights, Black Power, and Anti-Colonial Insurgencies, 1945 to 1976. Beginning with Section 1, Strains in the African Methodist Creed, notwithstanding the factional fights in the late 1940s that led to the special session of the General Conference and to the split at Wilberforce University, AMEs challenged segregation and systematic discrimination on the streets, in the courts, and at other levels of government. The growing intensity of an emerging civil rights movement, in which AMEs played an integral role, required a manifesto that provided denominational leaders with an opportunity to endorse this burgeoning black militancy. The enactment of an African Methodist Social Creed at the 1952 General Conference, drawn from Reverend C. Ransom, aimed to highlight the character that lay within the denominational DNA. Proletarian parishioners fought racial discrimination at industrial and military sites. Carl O. Dickerson of Payne Chapel in Duquesne, Pennsylvania, for example, protested bias against blacks at Carnegie Steel Plant. John Huey, whose three brothers were AME pastors, started work in 1947 at the Cary Furnaces in Rankin, Pennsylvania. He objected to the displacement of black laborers by white employees. As black freedom movements gained momentum, both during and after World War II, the dual obligation of institutional maintenance and insurgent activity split the clergy and the laity between those who emphasized one commitment over the other. Isaiah H. Bonner, during his tenure as bishop over South Africa, built 17 new edifices in South Africa and in northern and southern Rhodesia. He believed building and maintaining AME infrastructure ranked higher than political activities. Joseph A. Delane, son of an AME minister and graduate of Allen University, on the other hand, belonged to an increasingly combative corps of black South Carolinians who grew the number of NAACP chapters. Oliver L. Brown, assistant to the pastor at St. John AME Church, Topeka, testified in 1951 at the U.S. District Court for Kansas in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. In Section 2, Carriers of the Allen Activist Legacy, the civil rights movement drew from a minority of ministers and members, largely exclusively of the episcopacy. A. Philip Randolph, son of an AME pastor, was responsible for the March on Washington movement and the Fair Employment Practices Committee. Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander, granddaughter of Bishop Tanner and attorney for the Council of Bishops, became influential in her involvements in the NAACP, National Urban League, the National Council of Negro Women, and the National Bar Association. She was also chosen to serve on President Truman's Committee on Civil Rights. Archibald J. Carey Jr., a Chicago AME pastor and alderman, spoke at the 1952 Republican National Convention in Chicago and delivered an address that influenced Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. President Dwight Eisenhower appointed him chair of the President's Committee on Government Employment Policy. Rosa Parks, stewardess in her Montgomery AME church, in refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, triggered the Montgomery bus boycott. The author states, the Parks encounter on the Montgomery bus, though unplanned, was grounded in 2 decades of activism in Alabama that owed, in part, to her AME heritage. Parks, from her hometown congregation, Mount Zion in Pine Level, to St. Paul Church in Montgomery, regularly attended services and imbibed the message that Jesus Christ died for the sins of humanity and for that reason, Richard Allen stood for the dignity of African Americans. In Section 3, crafting an institutional response to the civil rights movement, AME leadership could scarcely ignore the burgeoning civil rights movement. Pressing issues and interactions with movement leaders, some of whom were AME ministers and members, compelled the denomination's cooperation and financial support in ending Jim Crow. Walter White, executive director of the NAACP, addressed the 1952 General Conference about the, quote, race question, end quote. Bishop Joseph Gomez, quote, pledged the support of the great AME Church to the NAACP. The 1956 General Conference showed AMEs as supportive and conversant with pressing civil rights issues. The Episcopal address advocated a permanent FEPC, and delegates approved resolutions calling for a Civil Rights Committee of the AME Church. In enacting a resolution in favor of desegregation, AMEs heard a speech from Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. At the 1960 General Conference, the Church extended support to the National Urban League. While endorsing the League, delegates created a structure to function as the liaison between the denomination and the civil rights movement. Frederick C. James offered a resolution to establish a Department of Social Action. Some denominational politicians feared that James, with the stature of a general officer, would attain a visibility comparable to that of leading civil rights activists. They preferred that he should have the less lofty title of social action consultant. AME students from Tennessee A&I, Fisk, Meharry Medical College, and the American Baptist College engaged in Nashville sit-ins between February and May 1960. James M. Lawson Jr. led a series of workshops that equipped them to occupy and desegregate downtown lunch counters. In addition, students at the AME-supported Daniel Payne College in Birmingham participated in a local sit-in movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at the 1964 General Conference and delivered his Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution speech, which insinuated that AME leaders were standing on the sidelines of the civil rights movement. While no bishop had a high profile in the Black freedom struggle, King surely knew that AMEs such as Archibald J. Carey Jr., Rosa Parks, Daisy Bates, and A. Philip Randolph saw themselves as energetic heirs to Allen's social holiness. Also in 1964, AMEs decided to pressure the U.S. government to enact the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. We see in Section 4, responses to Black urban issues, that after the Watts riots in 1965, AME leaders, while understanding the causes of Black rioting, preferred the tactics of the NAACP, to which they pledged continued support. AMEs and anti-poverty initiatives converged into broad backing for Black economic empowerment. There was pervasive AME support for the massive March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Archibald J. Carey Jr. became a well-known guardian of Black federal workers in his position as head of President Eisenhower's Committee Against Racial Bias in Government Employment. AME clergy in Memphis, including H. Ralph Jackson and Henry L. Starks, joined James Lawson and other clergy in vigorous support of Black sanitation workers and Martin Luther King Jr.'s objective to focus national attention on the desperate condition of the working poor. The social action energy of African Methodism morphed into housing partnerships between the denomination and the federal government. Bishop John D. Bright formed a nonprofit housing corporation to address the need for middle-income housing. In cooperation with the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, H. Ralph Jackson initiated projects in Memphis, New Orleans, Louisville, Seattle, and Bowling Green, Kentucky. Section 5, Reckoning with Civil Rights Opponents, discusses how some in the clergy and laity succumb to disguised but destructive associations with federal contacts who disparage the Black freedom struggle. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, for example, was convinced that the Communist Party was manipulating the civil rights movement and duping its leaders and participants into espousing anti-capitalist ideology. Archibald J. Carey Jr., who had been subjected to FBI surveillance, offered himself as the mediator in the tense relationship between Hoover and Dr. King. Edward Nixon, brother of President Richard Nixon, came to speak at the 1972 General Conference on the trail for his brother's re-election campaign. Even though Nixon was interrupting the opening service, Bishop Nichols welcomed him. 1,800 AMEs had no interest in what he had to say, as the Nixon administration had recently been unfriendly to blacks. In Section 6, Anti-Colonialism, African Independence, and African Methodism, AMEs operated in several territories in Africa, and indigenous ministers and members helped spearhead and participate in various anti-colonial campaigns. African Methodism in Africa operated in three interrelated spheres. Firstly, it operated in establishing and maintaining churches and schools. Secondly, indigenous members and ministers positioned the denomination to become conspicuously involved in fighting colonialism and white supremacy. And thirdly, there was a consensus with denominational officials to blend the civil rights struggle in the United States with the battle against European colonialism and white supremacy in Africa into a seamless freedom initiative within the Black Atlantic. Finally, in Section 7, Intellectuals of AME Pedigree on Freedom in the Black Atlantic, a cadre of mostly expatriate intellectuals in the 1950s and 1960s expanded the meaning of being AME. For example, Shirley Graham Du Bois, wife of W.E.B. Du Bois, was the daughter of AME pastor David Graham. She wrote on her perspectives on how Egypt was a bulwark against the re-entry of Western imperialism into Africa. She advocated for Africa in a newly independent Ghana and in a strategically powerful Egypt. Asa Davis's essays on religion in Egypt and Ethiopia showed Africans as major players in early Christian development. The Pan-Africanism of Graham Du Bois, Davis, and others of AME heritage aligned with colleagues who developed an energetic Black theology movement. AMEs, especially those who supported the Black student activism inspired by the rise of Black power, showed their accommodation to this shift to African American militancy. James H. Cohen launched the Black theology movement in 1969 with the publication of Black Theology and Black Power. At this point, please join Dr. Christina Dickerson-Cousin as she interviews another dynamic panel of AME scholars, clergy, and lay. Please submit your questions and comments via Facebook Live. Thank you.